right, we're finally ready to see what this color function is doing. This function that has bound itself to these cells upon once we've entered or hit the return key for a particular label or entry object. Let's walk through some of this code a little by little. We really only have this chunk in lines 2 through 5 to cover, and then we'll cover what's going on in lines 8 through 11. And then everything else that you see here is just a sort of superficial change to what's going on in lines 8 through 11. So let's get started. Remember that we're calling the color function with an entry widget and a row number and a column number, so we know where in space we're needing to make this change. The first thing that we have here on line 2 is that we're creating a variable named val, and what we're putting into that variable is the response of us going to the entry object. That get function is just one of the functions that we have for an entry object, and because it's an entry object, we sometimes want to go and get what's entered in that spot. And so that's exactly what's going to happen here, is we're going to go to that entry and we're going to retrieve what was just entered by the user. Now, what we want to do in line 3 is then take what is presumably a number there, and we want to store it as the value of that cell that is at row R, column C. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to our list of cells at row R, column C, and we're going to alter what is in the value function and set it equal to the value that was entered by our user, in essence. So what's this int with parentheses doing around it? Well, we don't really know what the user entered, and the keyboard has all sorts of keys on it. So we're hoping that they entered a number, but in theory, they could have written the word dog and hit enter on that, and we'd have no way of knowing. And we don't really want to store just what they entered there when thought of as anything that they could have entered from the keyboard. We want to take that and convert it to a numerical value before we go store it in a spot for a number. So that's what we're going to do. And even if they did play along really nicely and they entered a number like 8 into the cell, we want to think of that as a number and not as a string, where a string is any collection of garbage they could have entered from the keyboard. So that's what's going on in lines 2 and 3, hopefully very intuitive. Go to the cell, retrieve what they've entered, and then store that value with the proper data type inside the cell's object. So we make that change permanent. All right. But in essence, all we're doing in the rest of this function is updating the other things. So once that entry is there, there are other cells inside of this list of cells that need to be updated, because now they might have a left cell value, an up cell value, a down cell value, or right cell value. And we want to make the corresponding changes not just to the cell that now has a value, but to these adjacent cells who now have an updated adjacent cell. In order to do that, things get a little bit complicated because we want to actually change and make modifications to those entries. And we have something called cells, which is keeping track of our own cell data type, but something else is keeping track of the entries. And overall, that's the window object that we've created. Remember that every single frame object we created was added as a responsibility of the window. So we have a way of getting a list of everything that the window knows about, and that's to call, remember that the window was called the master. We added things to the window with the grid command. So if we want to know what does the window own, we can ask it for its grid slaves. Now I am strongly opposed to that notation and that wording, but I'm stuck with using it since that's what Tkinter decided to use. So I have gone and said, window, will you please tell me all of the grid objects that you own, and let's store that in something called entries. And the output of this is a list. So when we get the results of the window.gridslaves command, it will give us a list of entry objects or a list of grid objects that are owned by the window. And we're going to need that to make the proper modifications, which we'll do in the next video.